Cruel stereotypes and crass racial epithets, overt racism via name-calling, and soft bigotry through the use of affected speech, blackface, and coon songs. These are the legacies of minstrelsy in the United States, described by R.L. Hughes in 2006 as, quote, the most popular form of entertainment in antebellum America. The worst aspects of the American minstrelsy have been relegated to the dustbin of history. American society has at least evolved out of performing in blackface and openly using such harsh words on stage, particularly in any sort of entertainment meant for the whole family. But lots of what began on the minstrel stage has left vestiges in popular entertainment and even the music classroom till today. To be sure, not all songs and performance stylings for minstrelsy were so repugnant, but as educators, we must ask ourselves if using more banal songs such as Jingle Bells or My Old Kentucky Home is worth keeping the legacy of the American minstrelsy alive. A note here that while I reproduce in my paper much of the vile language often found in such music, I find that I don't have the stomach to repeat it out loud. It is no exaggeration to say that during my research for this paper, I occasionally had to take breaks to give myself some moments of respite away from the words I was reading. All of this is to say that, for purpose of this presentation, I won't be repeating the words, and when they're shown on screen, they will be asterisked. The lone exception took place in my opening sentence. There's a great argument to be made that I'm doing this more due to my own white fragility than to protect others, but that's a discussion for a different day. Let's begin with a brief history of minstrel songs in the United States. Blackface performances, in which white performers, almost always male, would darken their faces with grease or burnt cork, had begun long before this country became a nation. Early performances in the British Isles were largely based on what these white performers had seen in their travels, or on stories told by those who had seen enslaved people. As we might expect, this game of racist telephone led to unflattering stereotypes being portrayed, such as those by the mid-18th century performer Charles Dibdin. Dibdin created a character he performed in blackface named Mungo, whose behavior and speech patterns were meant to show the unrefined, uneducated nature of the African people. Such characters persisted as blackface performance shifted to the United States. In the 1820s, New York comedian Thomas Big Daddy Rice created a character named Jim Crow, the namesake for the racist segregation laws to come in the latter part of the century, and George Washington Davis created Zip C, a flamboyant character who spoke loud and dressed louder. These characters, and others based on them, remained part of minstrelsy for the better part of the next century. Noah Arcanow notes that in 1843, quote, 4 white men calling themselves the Virginia Minstrels darkened their faces, adopted exaggerated dialects to parody black speech, and performed a mixture of comedy and songs. This is widely regarded as the first organized minstrel show, and both the Virginia Minstrels and their approach to performance quickly spread around the nation. In addition to the blackface, affected dialect, and open use of racist terminology, minstrel shows were cruel in another way. From the first, they depicted a gross misrepresentation of what life on a plantation was like for enslaved people. In the plantation life of minstrel shows, stupid, ugly, lazy people of African descent led a peaceful, bucolic lifestyle with loving owners who they would often seek to deceive, cuckold, or otherwise wrong. For white audiences, particularly in the North, many of whom had never had interactions with enslaved people, such representations may have helped add to the complacency felt in allowing the South to hold on to its peculiar institution. Although slavery had been outlawed in 1865, Reconstruction efforts in the South fell woefully short of Lincoln and Grant's original intentions after a backroom deal to give Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency in 1876 saw Northern troops who had been enforcing Reconstruction forced to pull out of the South. Segregation, lynching, sharecropping, and Jim Crow laws soon followed. Racism and denigration of the black constituency of the South and some parts of the North continued. Thankfully, by the 1890s, America's interest in stage minstrel shows was waning. Unhappily, the shows found a home in burgeoning technologies, radio and records. On recordings or broadcast over the air, performers such as Al Jolson or the wildly popular Amos and Andy persisted in using the exaggerated dialect, demeaning stereotypes, and racial epithets so heavily utilized in minstrel shows. If the public had outgrown watching this type of performance, why would they continue listening to it? Arcanow suggests that, quote, perhaps the lack of the grotesque visual image allowed the oral version of minstrelsy to survive longer than the staged version. Now that we have a cursory understanding of the way minstrelsy developed and thrived in the United States, let's look at some of the ways it was used to create social and racial strata. As the nascent United States promised to take in the world's tired, its poor, its huddled masses yearning to breathe free, and the wretched refuse of its teeming shores, the country struggled to actually welcome the unwashed masses. As Caucasian groups such as immigrants from Italy or Ireland came to the United States, they found they were somewhat less welcome than the inscription on the Statue of Liberty might have suggested. Faced with discrimination in this new land, such groups endeavored to find their place. In my paper, I draw on this analogy. Imagine the prototypical schoolyard bully and his gang. These mean-spirited ruffians run the playground through fear, intimidating, mocking, or harming any student or clique that forms separately. Any new student to the school must decide, become a bully or become a victim. Whether unconsciously or not, some new Americans of the 19th century in the United States opted to become bullies, using the minstrelsy to push down African Americans while simultaneously elevating their own station in American society. In a society that valued whiteness, insulting and therefore creating distance from blackness was an easy way to acceptance. A case in point is Neil O'Brien, born to Irish parents in Western New York in 1868. A practicing Catholic, O'Brien was also part of the Knights of Columbus organization. When he began to accrue fame and success through his blackface performances, he sought to parlay this into increased social standing for himself, his organization, and his religion. O'Brien believed that minstrel shows were hilarious shows suitable for the whole family, good-natured fun that everyone could enjoy. Above all else, O'Brien knew how to work a crowd and knew that his racially denigrating cultural violence would consistently draw and entertain audiences. Such was his commitment to this craft that, even while performing for an audience of soldiers in World War I, including some African Americans, a large part of his act was dedicated to, as George Blake puts it, quote, denigrating black soldiers as lacking bravery and being dishonest. O'Brien's skits refused to acknowledge the role played by black people in the Army and implied that they were not fit for full citizenship. The message was clear. We may be Irish Catholic, but at least we're not one of them. To be sure, this approach wasn't taken by all Irish Catholics, nor were Catholics the only ones who exploited it. Many minstrel performers were Protestant, Italian, or Jewish. Sadly, as African Americans slowly gained more societal stature, they too began to use cruel racial stereotypes to otherize a newly arriving minority group. As Paul Schroeder describes, the first full-length, all-black comedy musical, A Trip to Seatown, debuted in 1898 and featured a song called All Just Look Alike to Me. This raises an interesting topic. What to make of the African Americans who participated in minstrel shows and their offspring? What to make of black audiences who attended them? Soon after minstrelsy's rise in the early mid-1800s, all black minstrel groups began staging shows, usually mimicking the characters created by white performers, and often proclaiming, with various levels of veracity, to be former slaves themselves and therefore experts in plantation life. In many areas, such authentic performances often outsold white minstrel troupes. Occasionally, this led to white theater owners refusing to book black performers so as not to take away opportunities for whites. It's difficult to say what pleasure black audiences took in minstrel shows at this time, when the performance's only relation to African Americans was an insulting one. My personal thought is that it was enjoyed as something like a roast that many blacks didn't take too seriously. It's worth noting, as Arcanow and Joseph Bird do, that minstrel audiences were divided less along racial lines than along economic and gendered ones. Lower-class whites and blacks, usually male, comprised the bulk of those in attendance. In a parallel to rap music today, middle and upper-class blacks who were trying to achieve upward mobility in society were the loudest voices speaking out against minstrel shows. As time marched on, black participation in the minstrel show began to shift. As noted before, by the 1890s, staged minstrel shows, particularly those featuring white performers blacking up, had largely faded away. There were still, however, stage shows that had distilled down to just the usually comedic storytelling songs, featuring characters such as Jim Crow, Zipsy, and the variations thereof, which came to be called C songs. They featured the usual affected dialect, epithets, and racial stereotypes of earlier minstrel shows. However, as African American performers began seeing their own station in American society slowly improve, they began taking back some of the power of these shows. Sometimes this was done blatantly, whereas earlier black minstrel performers would occasionally darken their faces to more fully fit the stereotype that had been created by whites. Schroeder describes a black performer named Bob Cole who, in the late 1800s, would perform songs in whiteface. At other times, black performers would borrow from the long tradition of coded messages. Similar to the use of spirituals in the Underground Railroad, performers would sing seemingly harmless words, content to placate and amuse their white audiences that were wrapped up with hidden messages, to entertain their black audiences who were in on the joke, and in so doing subvert the status quo. Bird tells us that, quote, by acclamation, Stephen Foster had become, by 1864, America's minstrel. His songs were mainstream, music represented in every medium during the latter half of the century. We know his music. Camptown Races, O Susanna, and My Old Kentucky Home are all songs that have lasted to this day, often being taught in music classrooms. I myself had my high school concert band play a piece that quoted My Old Kentucky Home just last year. Foster's relation to race is an interesting one. By the end of his life, he was a complete convert to the cause of abolition and improving the status of African Americans, likely spurred, Matthew Shaftel suggests, by the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had a great effect on many Northerners who had never before fully understood the horrors of slavery. Earlier in his career, his music was filled with affected dialect, epithets, and violence toward African Americans. As you can see here, he even managed to slip some into the style marking for his song Louisiana Belle, which tells the story of an enslaved man attempting to steal the wife of his master. Much has been made, and could be made, of Foster's work. A full dissection and discussion of his import, both musically and socially, would take the length of this presentation. We'll set aside also the use of songs that came from this tradition in K-12 music classrooms, as this too deserves its own full discussion. Let us instead shift to the way Foster, and minstrelsy as a whole, are treated in textbooks used in college classrooms. In his paper, Whitewashing Blackface Minstrelsy in American College Textbooks, Bird analyzes a number of texts used in either history or music appreciation courses. Two such books are from renowned publisher Prentice Hall: Crossroads, The Multicultural Roots of America's Popular Music, and Rockin' Out, Popular Music in the USA. Between the two of them, there's only one fleeting mention of minstrelsy, despite its immense popularity and influence on genres to come. There is no discussion of specific composers, no inclusion of song lyrics or musical styles, and nothing to describe the wide appeal of the genre. This exclusion, however, is likely the lesser of two evils when compared to the creative editing displayed in another text, America's Musical Landscape. This work does discuss Foster's import in the mid-19th century, but makes his lyrics to O Susanna much more palatable. The author's first edit comes in deleting the extremely problematic second verse referenced earlier. The text then goes one step further by including the third verse, which features some problematic imagery and affected dialect, as you can see here, but editing it to become benign. Whatever the author's reason for helping cover up Foster's racism, I suggest that doing so accomplishes nothing more than assuaging our own feelings of white guilt and perpetuating the cycle of hiding America's roots in racism. By looking at the history and popularity of minstrelsy in the United States, by exploring its openly racist roots and later subversive use by African Americans, by diving deeply into some of its performers and composers, and by analyzing texts for college students describing it, we can hopefully come to a better understanding of the way this harmful medium has shaped American popular music, culture, and music education today. It is not my intention to tell anybody how to teach their classes, what material to use, and what to leave behind, but I do hope that we can all make a greater effort at fully teaching a subject. To discuss American popular music and leave out minstrelsy, to reference Stephen Foster but ignore his racism, to deny the way whites used minstrel singing to denigrate and humiliate blacks, is to do a disservice to our students. Let us teach holistically and not ignore the stickier parts of our history. Remember the oft-quoted words of Spanish philosopher Jorge Santayana: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat."